I didn't think I'd ever be the guy writing one of these long, messy stories on Reddit, but here I am. And trust me, what I'm about to share, you won't see it coming. I never did. I've been sitting here for hours, fingers hovering over the keyboard, trying to figure out where to start. But I guess there's no better place than the brutal truth. My wife cheated on me. And not just with anyone, no. That would almost be bearable. She slept with my brother. Yeah, you read that right. My own flesh and blood. I guess I should back up a bit before diving into all the dirty details. I'm John, just another guy trying to get by in this messed up world. I'm not some kind of tragic hero, and I'm sure as hell not a saint. I'm a 36-year-old manager at a company I've been grinding away at for over a decade. On the outside, things seem good, great even. A house in the suburbs, a decent paycheck, and a wife who at one point I thought was my whole world. Emily. We met about 10 years ago. She was stunning, driven, and had this energy that made her the center of every room she walked into. An interior designer, always full of creative ideas and big dreams. When we first got together, we were that couple. People looked at us and probably thought we had it all. And for a while, I thought we did too. But life? It has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The past year, God, it was like watching everything we built crumble in slow motion. Emily's career, which used to be the source of so much pride, started to fall apart. She lost a huge client, a blow that hit her harder than I thought it would. At first, it was a little extra stress, some late nights. But soon, it spiraled into something worse. She started drinking. A glass of wine to unwind turned into 2, 3, then a bottle a night. I tried to be there for her, but between work and trying to hold everything else together, I wasn't around as much as she needed. Maybe that's where I fucked up. I tried to fix things, but I couldn't be everywhere at once. And Emily, she started slipping away. I'm not saying it was all her fault. I wasn't the perfect husband. But damn, I didn't expect what came next. Before we get into the juicy bits, let me explain a little about my family. My parents own a small business. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep us comfortable growing up. They've always been hardworking people, the kind that believe in earning your keep. But there's one thing that always pissed me off. My younger brother, Dan. He's 3 years younger than me and has always had it easier. While I was busting my ass in school and at work, he was the golden boy, getting everything handed to him. I don't think my parents even realized how obvious their favoritism was. Hell, they're still like that. It was always, John, you need to work harder, and oh, Dan's just figuring things out. They made excuses for him at every turn. And now, after all these years, they've even started talking about passing the family business to him. But I didn't care about the business. What I did care about was the fact that no matter how much I achieved, no matter how much I did for them, I always seemed to come second. And now, that second place has spilled over into my marriage. Dan, the brother who was always the favorite, always getting the breaks. And now, the brother who apparently thought it was okay to sleep with my wife. I don't even know how long it was going on before I found out, but when I did, man, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Let me tell you how it all started falling apart. I could tell something was off with Emily. Her drinking wasn't just about her job anymore. She was hiding things, disappearing for hours at a time, claiming she was meeting with friends or needing space. We had arguments, nasty ones, the kind where you say things you can't take back. I feel like a failure, John, she'd scream at me during one of our fights. You don't understand what it's like to lose everything. And I tried to be supportive. I really did. But every time I reached out to her, she pushed me away. It was like she'd already given up on us. I should have known something else was going on, but you know what they say about hindsight. It wasn't just me who noticed the changes. At work, Jim and Karen, two of my colleagues, could tell I was distracted. Jim's a good guy, practical. He suggested I take a vacation, maybe spend some time trying to fix things at home. But Karen? She was different. I could see how she looked at me, the sympathy in her eyes. And if I'm being brutally honest, I think part of her was waiting for my marriage to implode. She was always too eager to be there when I needed to vent, always a little too interested in my personal life. As for Emily, her family was no help either. Her mom would call every once in a while, trying to check in, but Emily pushed her away too. It was like she didn't want anyone around who could actually help her. Things really came to a head about 6 months ago. Emily had been particularly distant, and I'd noticed she'd been disappearing more often than usual. I confronted her one night after she stumbled and drunk. She was barely making sense, and I was sick of it. "Where the hell have you been?" I demanded, blocking her way as she tried to brush past me. With friends, she slurred, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "What do you care?" "What do I care?" "Emily, you've been drinking non-stop, disappearing for hours. Do you even know what you're doing anymore?" She shoved past me, muttering something under her breath, and collapsed on the couch. I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for so many years, and felt nothing. Just a deep, hollow emptiness. How do we end up here? And then the bomb dropped. A few days later, I was at my parents' house. Dan showed up, acting weird, distant even, which was unusual for him. I thought maybe he was having problems of his own, until I saw the way Emily acted around him. The stolen glances, the way they avoided each other's eyes. I don't know how I missed it before. That's when everything started to click into place, and I realized the unthinkable. My own brother had been sleeping with my wife. You know how they say things can't get worse after you've already hit rock bottom? That's bullshit. Things can always get worse. After I started piecing together that Emily had been screwing around with my brother, you'd think that'd be the end of it. But no, there was more to the story, and it was a whole lot messier than I ever imagined. It all started with the late nights. Emily had always been one to hang out with her friends now and then, grab a drink, let off steam. But over the past few months, her nights out became more frequent, more erratic. And it wasn't just wine with Laura anymore. It was entire evenings, sometimes till the early hours of the morning, when she'd stumble back in, reeking of cheap liquor and cigarettes. I confronted her a couple of times, but each argument was the same. Her telling me I was paranoid, overreacting, and that I needed to trust her. I wanted to believe her. Hell, I think part of me still did, even after everything. But the truth? It was gnawing at me. Every time she came home drunk, I felt the distance between us grow wider. I knew she wasn't just out with friends. I wasn't stupid. You can tell when your wife is slipping away from you, piece by piece. The worst part? I still held on to hope, thinking I could fix this. I should have known better. It wasn't just her drinking. It was the lies, the excuses. A meeting with Laura became a common refrain. But Laura, God bless her soul, wasn't that much of a social butterfly. She was a psychologist, always busy with clients. Something wasn't adding up. Then came Max, a name I'll never forget. I don't know when it started exactly, but I remember the first time I noticed the change in Emily. It was after one of those long nights out. She came home, her hair a mess, mascara smeared down her face. She didn't even try to hide the fact that she'd been drinking. I asked her where she'd been, and for the first time, she didn't give me the Laura excuse. "Just out. Met someone," she muttered, slurring her words. "Met someone?" "Oh." I pressed, feeling the weight in my gut, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer. "Nobody important. Some guy." I should have pushed harder, but I was tired. Too damn tired of the constant fights and endless suspicion. So I let it slide. That was my first mistake. A few days later, I found out who some guy was. His name was Max, homeless, dirty, and completely out of place in the parts of town where Emily usually hung out. Apparently, she met him outside a bar. She was drunk, as usual, and they just started talking. She never gave me all the details, but from what I've pieced together, it started as one of those tragic late-night conversations about life going to shit. You know the kind. When two broken people meet and bond over their shared misery. Max wasn't always homeless. He used to be somebody, or at least that's what Emily told me when I finally dragged it out of her during one of our fights. He'd had a career once, a family even, but something happened, a bad investment or some kind of fallout, and he lost it all. ended up on the streets with nothing but his pride, or whatever was left of it. Emily saw herself in him. They connected, she said, because they both knew what it was like to lose everything. Except, the way I see it, Emily wasn't the one who lost everything. I was. As if sleeping with my brother wasn't enough, now she was out there, finding solace in the arms of a homeless man. And then there's Brian, my best friend for years, the guy who'd been through thick and thin with me. Brian's the manager of this small bar, the same one where Emily started hanging out. I don't think he ever expected to be caught in the middle of this disaster, but that's exactly where he ended up. You see, his bar's got security cameras. And one night, Brian's going through the footage, just doing his job, when he sees her. At first, it's just Emily at the bar, talking to Max like they're old friends. They're laughing, sharing drinks, and Brian doesn't think much of it. But then things get ugly. Emily and Max stumble outside, drunk off their asses. And that's when it happens. Right there on the damn street, in the filthy alley behind the bar, they start going at it. Brian watched the whole thing on camera, stunned. He told me later that he didn't know what to do, that he felt sick to his stomach just seeing it. Here's the kicker. Brian sat on that video for a week. An entire goddamn week. He couldn't bring himself to tell me. He knew what kind of bombshell it was, and I guess he didn't want to be the guy who had to blow up my entire life. I can't blame him, I guess. Who the hell wants to be the bearer of news like that? But one night, we're sitting at his bar, just the two of us after closing, having a couple of beers like old times. I could tell something was eating at him. He kept glancing at me, fidgeting, looking like he was about to be sick. "John," he finally said, staring down at his drink, "there's something you need to know." I looked at him confused. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, like he was gearing up for something painful. "It's about Emily." Those words hit me like a freight train. I didn't even need him to say anything more. I already knew, deep down, that whatever was coming next was going to shatter whatever was left of my already crumbling world. There's this video," he said quietly, "from the cameras at the bar." "What are you talking about, Brian?" "I saw her, John. With him." My heart sank. "With who?" "Max." It felt like time stopped. I didn't even know how to react at first. I just sat there, staring at Brian, trying to process what he was telling me. "You need to see it," he said, pulling out his phone. And there it was, the video, the proof. Emily, my wife, with Max, the homeless guy, right there in front of me. Brian looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. "I'm sorry, man. I didn't know how to tell you." I couldn't even respond. I felt like I was going to throw up. After seeing the video, I couldn't think straight. Everything was just a blur. I'd lost my wife to a homeless man, and my brother was in the background, lurking as the second knife in my back. There wasn't anyone I could turn to, or at least that's what I thought. But then there was Laura. Laura had been Emily's friend for years. A psychologist, one of those people who seemed like she had it all together on the surface. She'd been the one trying to help Emily with her alcohol issues. And I'd known her mostly through the time she'd come by to check in on Emily or when we'd occasionally run into each other at social gatherings. But after all this, she was the only person left who had any real insight into what had been happening to Emily, and by extension me. I didn't plan on going to her, but after the video, I felt like I had no one else to talk to. Brian had already done his part, and I couldn't just go back to my parents and unload all this. They were still too busy fawning over Dan. So, one evening, with my head still spinning from everything, I texted Laura, asking if she could meet me. She agreed. That's just the kind of person she was, always willing to help. We met at a small cafe downtown. It was quiet, a place where nobody knew us, which was exactly what I needed. Laura showed up in her usual professional, yet calm manner. Her dark hair tied back in a neat bun, glasses perched on her nose. The kind of person who always seemed like she had a solution to every problem. But that night, as I sat across from her, I wasn't looking for solutions. I just needed to vent. I needed someone who would listen. "I'm falling apart," I blurted out before she even had a chance to sit down properly. No small talk, no preamble. I was too far gone for that. She looked at me, her eyes filled with concern. "John, what happened?" And that's when I told her everything. About Emily. About Max. About the video. I don't even remember how long I talked, but it felt like hours. She just sat there listening, her expression growing more serious with every word. I knew she was struggling, Laura finally said after I finished, but I had no idea it had gotten this bad. Neither did I muttered, staring down at my coffee cup. I didn't want to believe it. Laura leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. None of this is your fault, John. You've been trying to hold things together, but sometimes people just fall apart. I sighed, shaking my head. It feels like everything's falling apart. For a while, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything hanging between us. Then Laura said something that stuck with me. You need to take care of yourself, John. You can't keep carrying all of this alone. Her words hit harder than I expected. She was right. I'd been carrying the weight of Emily's problems, the betrayal, everything, and it was suffocating me. After that night, Laura and I started talking more often. At first, it was just about Emily, trying to make sense of what had happened, why she'd spiraled the way she had. But soon, the conversation shifted. Laura had her own baggage, her own scars from past relationships, and I found myself listening to her as much as she listened to me. She told me about a client she was working with, a woman who was going through something similar to Emily, struggling with addiction, spiraling out of control. Laura admitted it was affecting her more than she expected because of what was happening with Emily. It was strange seeing her vulnerability, but in a way, it made me feel less alone. We were both dealing with our own messes, and somehow, that brought us closer. One evening, after weeks of these conversations, Laura invited me over to her place. She said she wanted to talk more, but I think we both knew there was more to it than that. I showed up late after work, and we sat in her living room, sipping wine and talking about everything, about Emily, about life, about the things that had gone wrong for both of us. It started innocently enough, but as the night wore on, something shifted between us. The conversation slowed, the silences grew longer, and the space between us seemed to shrink. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but at some point, I found myself leaning in closer, and she didn't pull away. Her hand brushed mine, and before I knew it, we were kissing. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even something I had really thought about before that moment. But in that instant, with all the pain and anger and loneliness I'd been carrying, it felt like the only thing that made sense. We ended up in her bedroom that night. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel completely alone. It wasn't just about the physical connection, although God knows I needed that too. It was about feeling understood, feeling seen by someone who knew exactly what kind of hell I was going through. The next morning, though, reality hit hard. Laura and I sat in awkward silence over coffee, both of us knowing we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. She tried to maintain her usual professional demeanor, but there was a tension in the air that neither of us could ignore. John, she said softly, we need to be careful. This can't become something we regret. I nodded, but I didn't really know what to say. Part of me already regretted it, but another part of me felt more alive than I had in months. I wasn't sure what was happening between us, but I knew it was more than just one night of weakness. Over the next few weeks, things with Laura became complicated. We still met, still talked, but there was an unspoken tension between us now. The lines between friendship and something more had blurred, and neither of us seemed to know where it was going. Things with Emily only got worse after I found out about her and Max. I didn't think it was possible for her to spiral any further, but I was wrong. The woman I once knew, the woman I thought I'd grow old with, had become a stranger. Her drinking got out of control. She'd pass out on the couch most nights, bottles of cheap wine scattered around the house like trophies of her self-destruction. At some point, she stopped even trying to hide it. She wasn't out with friends anymore. She was just gone. I tried to confront her, to get through to her, but it was like talking to a brick wall. Emily had checked out of our marriage, of her own life even. and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Every conversation was the same. She'd stare at me with those cold, distant eyes and mutter something incoherent, then wander off to God knows where. But it wasn't just the alcohol. It was her whole attitude. She'd come home, reeking of booze and smoke, barely able to stand, and we'd get into these explosive arguments. I'd ask her where she'd been, and she'd just laugh in my face. "Why do you care?" she'd slur, leaning against the wall for support. "It's not like it matters anymore." "Of course it fucking matters, Emily," I'd shout back, my voice echoing through the empty house. "You're my wife. What the hell is wrong with you?" But it was like she couldn't hear me, like I wasn't even there. One night, she disappeared again, but this time it was different. I didn't know where she'd gone, but she was out later than usual. When she finally stumbled through the door at 3 a.m., I knew something was up. There was this look in her eyes, a mixture of shame and fear. She wouldn't talk to me, just locked herself in the bathroom and stayed there for hours. When she finally came out, she was quieter than usual, avoiding eye contact. It didn't take long for me to figure out what had happened. Max was back. I didn't know all the details at first, but Emily eventually let enough slip for me to piece it together. She'd run into him outside that same damn bar. And even though everything between them had been a disaster, she couldn't help herself. It was like she was drawn to him, to the mess they'd created together. Max wasn't the same either. Emily said he tried to push her away this time. Apparently, the guilt had caught up with him. He knew what he'd done, what they'd both done, and he couldn't handle it. But despite his attempts to distance himself, they still ended up talking, still ended up together in some twisted way. Max said he was sorry. Emily muttered one night, after another bottle of wine. He said he never meant for any of this to happen. I could barely look at her. "You're still seeing him, aren't you?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. From what I gathered, Max had been successful once. He wasn't always the wreck I'd seen in that video. He'd had a life, a family, a career, but something had gone wrong, really wrong. He'd lost it all in one fell swoop, and now he was nothing more than a broken man, wandering the streets, looking for meaning in the chaos. Emily was drawn to that, to his pain, his failure. Maybe it made her feel less alone, like she wasn't the only one drowning in her own mess. Max tried to pull away from her, tried to end whatever it was they had, but Emily kept going back. Every time they saw each other, the tension grew. Max was guilty, ashamed, and Emily was trapped in the hell she'd created, unable to escape. They were two lost souls, bound together by their shared misery. Meanwhile, things with Laura were different. She became my lifeline in all of this. After that night at her place, things had changed between us, but in a good way. We'd grown closer, not just emotionally, but physically too. I won't pretend that what we were doing was perfect. There was still a part of me that felt guilty, like I was betraying some part of myself. But I couldn't deny that being with her made me feel human again. Laura was the opposite of Emily. Where Emily had become chaotic, destructive, and unreachable, Laura was stable, calm, and understanding. She didn't just listen to me. She made me feel like I wasn't alone. I found myself spending more and more time with her, and the lines between emotional support and something more blurred until there was no distinction. One night, after another long talk, Laura looked at me with that calm, thoughtful expression she always had. "John, you deserve better than this," she said quietly, her hand resting on mine. "I don't even know what I deserve anymore," I admitted, my voice heavy with exhaustion. She squeezed my hand. "You deserve someone who cares about you, who values you." I didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said enough. She was right, and I knew it. Laura and I kept seeing each other, and over time, what had started as comfort and support turned into something more. We'd spend evenings together, talking, laughing, and eventually falling into each other's arms. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, a connection that I hadn't felt in years. Laura wasn't just my emotional anchor anymore. She was my escape from the nightmare my life had become. And Emily? She kept disappearing, kept spiraling. I'd see her less and less, and when she was home, she was either too drunk to function or too distant to care. The woman I'd once loved was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of who she used to be. Max was still in the picture, lurking in the background, a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. But with Laura, I started to feel like maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this mess. A way to move on. It had been months since I had seen Emily for more than a few minutes at a time. By then, my life had become so disconnected from hers that it was like living with a stranger. When she was even home, that is, I had settled into a strange, distant routine with Laura, growing closer to her, while Emily drifted further and further away. But that didn't mean Emily wasn't still out there. I knew she was. Even though I tried to push her out of my mind, the reality of our broken marriage lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. She was still part of my life, whether I liked it or not. That's when I heard about the illness. Emily had been sick for a while, long before I ever found out. It started with small things, fatigue, bouts of nausea, even some weight loss. But, of course, she never mentioned any of it to me. She was too busy disappearing into the bottom of a bottle or running off to God knows where. I don't even think she realized how bad it had gotten at first. Maybe she just thought it was the drinking or the stress of everything catching up with her. But then it got worse. The nights of heavy drinking turned into days where she could barely get out of bed. At some point, she must have decided to get checked out, probably more out of desperation than anything else. And that's when she got the news. HIV positive. I didn't know about any of this at first. I wasn't around. By the time she got the diagnosis, I was already long gone, emotionally speaking. We were living under the same roof, but barely speaking. Laura had become my refuge, and Emily, well, Emily was a ghost of her former self. But when she found out, that was her wake-up call. One night, out of nowhere, I got a call from Emily. It had been weeks since she'd made any real effort to reach out to me, and I wasn't exactly eager to pick up. I stared at my phone for a while, debating whether or not to answer. Part of me wanted to just let it ring, but something in my gut told me this was different. So, I answered. John. Her voice was shaky, fragile, almost unrecognizable. I need to talk to you. What is it, Emily? I asked, not bothering to hide the exhaustion in my voice. I was done with her games, done with all of it. I'm sick, she said, barely able to get the words out. I need to tell you something. There was a long pause. I didn't know how to respond. Sick? Was this another ploy for attention? Another one of her attempts to reel me back in with some sob story? I'm serious, John, she continued, her voice breaking. I have HIV. My stomach dropped. For a moment, I couldn't process what she just said. HIV? Was she serious? How the hell had this happened? I found out a few weeks ago, she went on, her words tumbling out in a rush. I've been feeling sick for months, and I finally went to the doctor. They ran tests, and I got the results. I could hear the desperation in her voice. She was terrified, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something, pity maybe, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to bridge the chasm that had formed between us. Emily, I don't know what to say. I muttered, my mind racing. How? How did this happen? There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear her struggling to find the words. It was Max, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know he was sick. I swear I didn't know, John. I clenched my jaw, feeling a wave of anger and disgust wash over me. Max. Of course it was Max, the man who had taken everything from me. Now he had taken this from her too. But despite everything, all I could think was, how the hell did it come to this? John, please, she said, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I need you. I need you to help me. Help her? After everything? After she'd cheated on me with my own brother. After she'd thrown her life away with Max. After she'd destroyed whatever was left of our marriage. I couldn't do it. Not anymore. I don't know what you want me to do, Emily, I said, my voice cold, detached. I'm done. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then, I heard her muffled sobs. She didn't say anything else. She just cried, and I stood there listening, feeling nothing. She'd lost me, and she knew it. There was no going back. Whatever we had was long gone, buried under the weight of betrayal and broken promises. That night, after hanging up, I found myself thinking about Emily more than I had in weeks. I thought about the woman I'd married, the life we'd once had, the dreams we'd shared. And I thought about how it had all unraveled, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the wreckage of our past. Emily's illness wasn't just physical. It was the culmination of everything that had gone wrong in her life. Our life. The drinking, the cheating, the lies, the self-destruction. She had spiraled so far out of control that even now, faced with the consequences of her actions, she couldn't pull herself out of the hole she'd dug. In the days that followed, I heard bits and pieces about Emily's condition through mutual friends and family. She was struggling, emotionally, physically, in every way possible. The HIV diagnosis had hit her hard, but it was more than that. It was the realization that she had burned every bridge, that she had no one left. Even her own mother had pulled away, unable to handle the weight of Emily's self-destruction. I tried not to think about it. I had my own life to worry about now, my own future with Laura, my own path forward. But every once in a while, in the quiet moments, I'd think about Emily, and I'd wonder if things could have been different, if I could have saved her, if I could have saved us. But in the end, I knew the truth. She was beyond saving. She had been for a long time. The day I finally let go of the guilt, it felt like I could breathe again. For so long, I'd carried the weight of everything that had happened. Emily's betrayals, her downfall, the wreckage of our marriage. But standing there with Laura by my side, watching the sun rise on a new chapter of my life, I realized something important. I wasn't responsible for Emily's choices. She had made them long before I ever had a chance to fix things. And now, I was free. It didn't happen overnight, of course. The process of moving on was slow, painful even. After that call from Emily about her illness, I spent weeks replaying everything in my mind. Could I have done more? Should I have seen the signs earlier? But the truth was Emily had been slipping away long before Max, long before the drinking, long before the lies. And I had been holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. Laura helped me see that. She'd been my anchor through the storm, the person who reminded me that life could still be good, even after everything. We grew closer with each passing day, and as the months went by, the connection between us deepened. What had started as emotional support had become something real, something solid, something I hadn't felt in years. We'd often talk about the future, where we wanted to go, what we wanted to do with our lives now that the dust had settled. For the first time in a long time, I felt like there was a future worth planning for. Laura wasn't just my therapist, my confidant, she was my partner now, and we were building something together. Emily, on the other hand, had faded from my life. I'd hear snippets about her here and there, mostly from mutual friends who still checked in on her. She was struggling, that much was clear. The HIV diagnosis had shaken her to her core, and with nobody left to turn to, she was forced to confront the reality of the choices she'd made. Her drinking had slowed down, I'd heard, but the damage was already done. Emily was a shadow of her former self, living with the consequences of a life she'd destroyed with her own hands. But I wasn't part of that world anymore. My life was with Laura now. We decided to take a trip together, a symbolic fresh start. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a weekend getaway to a quiet little cabin in the woods. We wanted to disconnect from everything, Just be with each other and figure out what came next. The peace and quiet of that cabin, the simplicity of it all, was exactly what I needed. It was a chance to leave the past behind and look forward to something new. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, Laura reached for my hand. "You've come a long way, you know," she said, her voice soft, her eyes full of understanding. "I don't think I could have done it without you," I admitted. She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "You were always stronger than you gave yourself credit for, John. You just needed to see it." I thought about that for a moment, letting her words sink in. For so long, I'd been trapped in the chaos of my failed marriage, convinced that I was somehow to blame for it all. But Laura was right. I had survived. I had come through the other side, scarred but not broken. And now I had a second chance. As the days turned into weeks, we started making plans. Real plans. Laura had a private practice she wanted to expand, and I was considering a career change, something less demanding, something that allowed me to focus on the things that really mattered. We talked about moving in together, about what it would mean to truly start over. And for the first time, the idea of a new life didn't feel terrifying. It felt exciting. In the end, the past didn't haunt me anymore. Emily had made her choices, and I had made mine. The guilt, the anger, the bitterness, it was all fading away, replaced by something new. Hope. Maybe that sounds cliché, but it's the truth. Laura gave me that hope. She reminded me that there's always a chance to start again, even when everything seems lost. The last time I heard anything about Emily, she was living alone, struggling to manage her illness and the consequences of her actions. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a sense of finality. Our lives had diverged, and there was no going back. I'd mourned the end of my marriage long enough. It was time to let go. Laura and I took a walk together that day, just a simple stroll through the woods, hand in hand. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic moment of closure, just the quiet understanding that we were moving forward. I wasn't the same man I'd been when I first met Emily, and that was okay. I didn't need to be. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was ours, and that was all that mattered. As we walked, I glanced back once, just for a moment. The past was there, lingering in the distance, but it didn't have a hold on me anymore. I turned back toward Laura, and we kept walking, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The past was behind us. The future was ours.